We have a special panel on present state of India-China relations. We have four very distinguished panelists. We are meeting in the aftermath, in the afterglow of Mamallapuram Informal Summit, when the Chennai Connect was introduced, and Astana understanding and Wuhan spirit reaffirmed. Clearly, as a result of second informal summit, it became possible to bring relations, India-China relations, back on a more stable footing after a period of some stress and strain. We have sort of resumed momentum in bilateral engagement. Whole lot of high-level exchanges are taking place. New dialogue mechanisms, including one on trade investment at the level of Vice Premier on the Chinese side and Finance Minister on our side, has been introduced. To that extent, one can say that there has been a positive impact as a result of second informal summit. At the same time, it remains a fact that there are outstanding issues, there are structural challenges, there are underlying concerns on both sides that remain unaddressed, unresolved. And as a result, as before the informal summit, likewise after the summit, we have a relatively complex engagement in India and China. To discuss this engagement, as I mentioned earlier, we have a distinguished panel with us. So I'll start with Professor Alka Acharya, who's honorary fellow with the Institute of Chinese Studies and also Professor Center for East Asian Studies at JNU. Alka will be speaking on India-China relations and limits of diplomatic management. I've discussed with the panelists, they would like to make relatively short presentations so that we have enough time for discussion, especially comments and questions coming from floor. We would like that to be a major part of this panel. So our panelists will be speaking for, say, 8 to 10 minutes. In fact, Alka wants to speak for even less than that. We'll begin with Alka. We'll save some time, and then we'll give more time to other panelists. Alka, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Indeed, I do plan to make my presentation very brief and very, very pointed. So my thanks to the organizers and Srimati and Avinash, who have really put together a fantastic conference. It's a huge exercise. As you know, this is the 12th chapter, and putting this together is really something very Herculean task, and to do it with support of the students is think of doing it without the support of the students is impossible. So big round to the young students who have also helped to make this thing a success. Now, as I said, my brief is a very, very focused, limited one, and it's located within the basic ethos of this conference, which is this conference started with the intention of bringing together young scholars, people who have just started their doctoral research on China on a single platform, and get a sense of how really the future of interest and research in China is taking place. This was essentially intended to be a dialogue between the young scholars doing their research, the senior faculty and experts and policymakers who would then give the inputs and hopefully give them new ways of looking at their research. So this was essentially the objective behind this All India Conference of China Studies. And here, therefore, I intend to bring back a bit of a focus on that by talking about the limits of diplomatic engagement. There are much more experienced and far superior people who can talk on the policy, the ongoing dynamics at the level of the leadership, and how the policy is really being shaped. So there are far more superior people, and therefore I will not be the fool to tread into that angelic domain. My focus, when I say the limits of diplomatic engagement, it's not really also about talking about the diplomatic process. Instead, I'm trying to bring the focus on when we are thinking of research on China, how does this diplomatic engagement help or hinder our objectives? Since yesterday, we've been hearing some angst, especially when it came from young Anand, who said that we must try and make a distinction between policy and studies. We saw the papers that have been presented, which have a very strong current developments kind of focus. We see a greater tendency to lean towards what is making news and what is likely to be getting more traction. So in that kind of a framework, we often set aside those concerns which should really be guiding our research and scholarship. Now, I am not for a moment suggesting that current events therefore should not be examined or studied or analyzed or critiqued. Of course, they have their own role and relevance, and they have their own location, as it were. But when we are talking of young scholars, the question is really, how are they orienting themselves to do research on China? And therefore, when I formulate my concern in terms of limits of diplomatic management, management actually is a term that is coming out of the kind of reading that I've been doing ever since Doklam, in fact. If you take a basic sample of writing on India-China since Doklam by strategic experts or even by scholars, and most of them are using this term, it is important to manage this relationship. The importance of managing this relationship well, managing the border, managing this, managing that, and it's coming up very regularly. In other words, a large section of opinion within this country is talking about the importance of managing this relationship well. Now, that's one element of the realpolitik, that's one aspect of the governmental process, that's one aspect of foreign policy, that you manage your relationships. But the word management, and if you sort of just break it down, unpack management, it's really not so much in terms of a vision and a resolution. It's more in terms of how you address and handle a situation on the ground. And you bring together the best kind of resources, you bring the best elements that you have, and you guide them in a way in which you ensure that it does not really upset the situation on the ground. There is a certain element of status quoism in it, that you ensure that things are kept within the limits of well-oiled process of movement. Now, this is the problem, that when we start looking at understanding China from this perspective, then we are really not going back to the more important questions that you should begin your research or your interest on China with. Now, one aspect is this whole management, and the other thing invariably that we come across in the writings today is about how China is India's biggest challenge, but we must also realize that it is an opportunity. So this challenge and opportunity is the kind of option that is presented to us, which we must manage well. Now, again, I have no quarrel with that. I think it's a very eminently practical and a sensible way to go about a situation in which no immediate and no quick resolutions are possible. So your focus is to ensure that it does not upset the status quo. Fine, and that's as far as the boundary dispute is concerned, and clearly that element is the part of the challenge. But that's the problem today. How do we manage this challenge and opportunity? But I therefore am saying that the limits of this approach is that it does not let us go into the history of the problem. If the problem is that China is a challenge and an opportunity, what is the history of this challenge and opportunity? How is China a challenge? In what way is it a challenge? And in what way is it an opportunity? So if you look at the writings again on what kind of opportunities China presents, there's a very standard list, A, B, C, D, E, and I think Venkat will come on those kind of opportunities, which essentially are seen in the economic commercial realm today. There are some pro forma references to how India and China can work together, but nobody goes further than that. Because immediately, as we list out the opportunities, each one goes along with a challenge. So again, why I'm saying this is that when I see the state of the writing, especially focused on contemporary issues, this is the limited range which presents itself. And therefore, as research scholars, we have to ask ourselves the question that how do we understand the history of this challenge and the nature and the history of and how do we understand the history of the opportunities that, okay, now 3 more minutes precisely. We have here scholars who have looked at this long range of history, and it seems to me that, in fact, there is an embarrassment of history that we can choose from. We've already had references to those ancient linkages. Fine, some people think that those ancient linkages do not really represent a very significant part of our reality today, that they are more in the realm of myth and conjecture. But there's equally another set of historical interactions. Leading practitioner here, Professor Sheel, who has looked at the colonial period interactions. This fantastic book about Gadadhar Singh's expedition, his diary, which if you people have not read, I would suggest you read, because it opens up again a huge new field of inquiry. So there is that whole colonial period interaction. And then there is that interaction, that very brief interaction of that romantic bhai-bhai phase. If we were to share away the romanticism, we will see that there was a very strong realistic streak that actually motivated immediate post-war China and India. That the China-India story somewhere had to figure in any kind of engagement with Western institutions, Western systems, Western architecture. Of course, that faded very quickly. So my point is that there are a lot of histories which are completely unresearched, under-researched, and very little of that history actually comes into our current understanding and assessment. What do Indian and Chinese historians have to say about each other? There is a history of India and China which is very much part of our consciousness, if you will, or our understanding. We all know what Hegel had to say about China and India. He denied that India and China had any history. Between Herder and Hegel, in fact, India-China ceased to contribute to world history in that sense. And when Professor Mohanty spoke about India and China, and indeed a lot of Asian countries actually questioning the way these historical narratives have come about, that is the beginning of a new look at how India and China are going to shape. So clearly, this is a tall order. This is a big agenda. I think what I am trying to really come back to is that let's ask questions which do not take the givens as something set in stone. Are India and China, so yesterday there was a paper that India and China are destined to, I mean, not that, what exactly was the title? I'm sorry, I don't want to misquote it, but there was one which actually suggested that India and China are headed for a kind of a conflict. So if you're going to begin with questions like this, rather than what are the basis for a possible, or why is it that these issues are seen as conflictual? So you don't have to really start with givens, but you start with questioning what are seen as certitudes today. So I am therefore arguing that the diplomatic process, leave the diplomatic process to those who are far more experienced and proficient in that game. While that would be of interest to us as, you know, aspects of the India-China engagement, our questions more should be about the fundamental nature of this relationship. What are the kind of trajectories that have brought India and China to this path? And how are those trajectories helpful in understanding what India and China are all about? So let's get a bit more in depth as far as studying India-China is concerned. The interest in how they are going to be handling this summit or that summit or the issues that are coming up is good for television debates and for some really good pros and cons being thrashed about. So see that as part of the practitioner's process. But before you sort of move into that realm, first be firm about the ground on which you are standing. That's my limited plea, and that's where I will stop.
Thank you, Alka. Now we move on to our next panelist, General S.L. Narasimhan, Director General, Center for Contemporary Chinese Studies, New Delhi, who will be speaking on India-China relations in the contemporary era.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I sincerely thank all the organizers, particularly what Alka mentioned, the young people who have put together this conference is something which is very encouraging for a subject that interests all of us, I'm sure, in this room. And thanks for also giving me this opportunity to speak here. What I intend doing in the next 5 to 6 minutes is I'm going to flash some slides, but I'm going to touch only a few points because the time is limited. The other points, if you have any queries, that we'll take it in the discussion session. I've summarized this relationship right from the time China became a People's Republic of China into various periods. I'm going to talk about only the last two. That is the period in this new millennium, 2000 to 2013. That initial stage was a period of strategic cooperation and wherein tactical differences existed. 2013 to now, it appears to have changed tack. There are some strategic differences appearing, whereas the tactical understanding is improving. So this is something that I thought I'll highlight in this particular period. There are a number of divergences which I have noted down. One is the boundary question, which actually is, at the moment, it is a strategic piece in the sense that there is the only boundary, even though it is not demarcated, even the line of actual control is not very clear on ground to people, but still there is no offensive intent in that particular thing to say that at least there's no firing that has taken place in the last about 52 years. And there are tactical issues associated with it. That is the time when you get to hear of some face-offs here and there. The tactical issues continue to remain. India's perceived support to Tibet cause needs no explanation. And lastly, the last point which I have highlighted is the influence in South and Southeast Asia is something that is becoming a bit of a divergence. And that also emerges from the point which I have mentioned there of competitive interest in the neighborhood. So this is something which is driving this divergence in the influence in the South and Southeast Asia. In the Southeast Asia, I have also mentioned single draft negotiating text. That is the code of conduct that is going to be coming up in the future between China and Southeast Asia. So this is something that is being discussed about, and there are interest that we need to plug it into this. Disaster relief, why I have mentioned as a divergence is because if you look at the disaster relief in Maldives water crisis and Nepal earthquake, you found a kind of a competitiveness coming into the effort that was going in for HADR. if you are handling HADR, that is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and you have two competing people trying to get into the system, you find that itself, managing that itself becomes a huge issue. So that is why I thought it's a divergence, but it can be worked on and it can be a cooperative effort subsequently. Freedom of navigation in South and East China Sea, I have mentioned INS Airavar, basically because the ship, when it did a port call in 2011 and it was coming out, it was bust on by the Chinese PLA Navy. So freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight is something that is a question mark at this point in time. The water, I'm sure dams on Yarlung, Sangpo, etc. were discussed in the previous session, and so I'll not highlight that. But what you need to probably look at is the trade balance in favor of China. So this is something that we need to look at. Can you just go to the hyperlink, please? The trade balance, the third point. Yeah. Now this is the data. If you could look at, you find that this trade imbalance is creating issues, and that is how it gets figured in every discussion that takes place in the bilateral relations. Can you go back, please? Yeah. And then the next divergence comes up in Quad and Indo-Pacific, and that of course is a huge issue, and Chinese are extremely sensitive to Quad as well as Indo-Pacific, and that is something that is a work in progress. RCEP is the latest one which has come up a couple of days ago. We have said that we are not going to be part of this, but the door is open. They have said that it is open for negotiations further. So these are the divergences, and coming on to the convergences, you will find the number reducing considerably, and that is what explains the relationship actually speaking. So economic ties are a convergence in BRICS Bank, AIB, Wuhan Spirit, Chennai Connect. I am sure Ambassador Nanda will talk about the last two. But BRICS Bank and AIB are actually a good convergence point to talk about. Anti-piracy operations, the views are similar, but the functioning of the navies is different. So that is something, even though there is a little divergence, but the convergence is also there. The rest of the things I have already mentioned there, you may like to have a look at it. Some of the facts which probably people who are looking at the India-China relations on binary terms miss out. So that is the reason I put these. There are a lot of things that are happening in the bilateral relationship on the positive side also. This year particularly, the marine exports have tripled in the last 9 months, and it is likely to cross $1 billion this year. This is a good positive that has taken place in the last about 9 months. Impact on the region. The India's relations with our neighbors comes under pressure because of this difficult relationship that you have. And China's relations with India has a polarizing effort in this, in the sense that some countries have to think of choosing which side to go, and they are actually hedging. That is the third point which I have mentioned. They look for the benefit, they hedge between India and China. Functioning of the SAARC is affected, and India-China relations have got an impact on all these countries which I have mentioned there. How does China view India? We did an analysis of the Chinese media and the Chinese writings, and we found these coming out of the trend. Though the presentation is longer, I just called out the important findings of this. China is apprehensive about India's major power relations, simultaneously recognizes India's strategic autonomy. This point came up even in Chennai Connect. Appreciates professional capability of India's armed forces, but doubts the capability of weapon platforms and defense industry. China has a more positive view of India's culture, IT, space capabilities, but a poor view of standard of 4G, railway safety, etc. And also there is a mixed perception on India's economy with some positives and comparatively more number of negatives. This is how the Chinese look at it, because if you look at a bilateral relationship, then it's very important to understand as to how the other side views us. These two slides I will skip because Ambassador Nanda is going to cover this, and I will. Sorry, sir. No. If there's anything left, okay. If you go, you can just go through it. It's a very self-explanatory kind of slide. Many people think that the process of Wuhan summit started after Dolam started occurring, but that is not the case. This was in the works even before. And then the informal summits were questioned by some. Well, what is the effect of this? Is it correct to do it? Is it Is it going to have a good follow-up on this? Is it going to be institutionalized? A lot of questions came up. And effect of that I have noted down there, and these are the things that came of that particular Wuhan spirit. Chennai Connect, you find these are the issues that were highlighted during that meeting. What happens is, the institutionalization of this informal summit process seems to be happening. We are already the third summit invite has come, our PM has accepted, and so this process seems to be getting institutionalized. Institutionalized. And it also helps in another thing, that it nudges action, in the sense that when you're going to the next summit, people are going to sit back and then think what has happened on the last summit and what is the progress that has been made. It nudges a bit of an action that probably would have taken more time. So this is how I see this, and those are the outcomes of that Chennai Connect, as you can see that there. More on that in the question and answer session in case something is coming up. There are a few suggested measures I have given here. You can just go through it. If there are any questions, again we can discuss it later.
Read it out with us.
Okay. Strategic cooperation is one thing that has an influence on international and regional organizations. The regional architecture, there are so many sub-regional architectures, and there was a reference to this by one of our PMs earlier also, on Asian security architecture. Can we think of that? Energy security, oil buyers club is something that is being talked about. Complementary economic cooperation, military diplomacy, and increased Chinese investment in India, which has been a point of discussion in both the informal summits. Industrial development, China is quite strong on construction technology, manufacturing. Can we leverage that is one question. Second is the business integration. Can you go to the hyperlink, please, if you don't mind? Just click on that arrow. It's not going? Yeah. So please have a look at this. We have a lot of discussion on 5G, Huawei, etc., but Huawei is already into the system. They got 40% of the market share in the mobile technology, etc. You find they are going to supply a lot of smart inverters. Honor Smart TV, basically using Huawei operational system, is already into India. ZT, Chungsing Telecom Equipment, Fastway Transmissions is the Indian company which has gone into collaboration to provide FTTH and IPTV services. Sinan is going to supply 1 gigawatt worth of solar inverters. OnePlus and Transsion are going to export their mobiles from India. Basically, in addition to this, you also find investments from the Chinese side on fintech, social media apps, MSMEs, etc., etc. So this is something that is happening. So is there some way of looking at it as a leverage is something that we need to look at. Can you go back, please? Cooperation in agriculture, the agricultural technologies are good. That is something which you can think about. Sports diplomacy is something that we can really think about. Even amongst the armed forces, this is one aspect that goes without any kind of apprehensions in the minds of both the sides. Cultural exchanges, population policy, people to people I have already mentioned earlier. And there I stop. If there are any questions, I'll take it in the later.
Thank you very much, Jan Narasimhan, for that wide-ranging presentation. Now we move on to Ambassador Biren Nanda, who is Distinguished Fellow with Delhi Policy Group and former Ambassador of India to Indonesia and High Commissioner to Australia, Consul General in Shanghai. He'll be speaking on From the Wuhan Spirit to the Chennai Connect, analyzing the broad trends in India-China relations. Over to you, Biren.
So my presentation is really about what are the broad trends that characterize the present phase of India-China relations. First, external factors are driving the current phase of Sino-Indian relations. The United States has characterized China as a revisionist power which seeks to challenge the United States' dominant position in Asia. As long as there are continuing tensions in Sino-US relations, China will make positive overtures towards India without any assurance that it will not revert to a confrontationist posture under different circumstances in the future. Second, India-China summit diplomacy is trying to reinvent bilateral relations. The two summits embodying the Wuhan spirit and the Chennai Connect are an attempt to reinvent bilateral relations in order to bring stability to the relationship. These efforts rest on the foundation of maintaining respect for each other's core interests and aspirations. Third, strategic communication is a vital element. Closer strategic communication between the two leaders has been the overarching objective. Understanding each other's national visions, developmental priorities, aspirations, and red lines that must be respected in order to maintain stability in the relationship has been the priority. Fourth, China has little incentive to be flexible. At present, China is well ahead of India in terms of comprehensive national power. It has a GDP 5 times that of India and a defense budget 3 times that of India. China likely believes that the gap will increase over time. China has therefore little incentive to be flexible and make concessions on the border dispute. However, amongst the current tensions in Sino-US relations, China does have an interest in managing differences and minimizing tensions along the border with India. Fifth, at Mamallapuram, both sides reiterated their interest in a stable border. The reiteration of guiding principles enshrined in the April 2005 agreement for the eventual settlement of the boundary question and the objective of the maintenance of peace and tranquility on the border leaves open the possibility of a renewed interest in the LAC clarification process under Article 9 of the Accord. It may be no coincidence that Chinese scholars have expressed an interest in LAC clarification in the post-Doklam phase. Sixth, the Chinese are unlikely to prioritize the resolution of India's trade deficit. The India-China trade deficit has continued to grow despite years of discussions between the two sides. While the Chinese side views it as a structural problem that cannot be solved in the short term, we regard it as an issue of market access, requiring Beijing to address non-tariff barriers. On the RCEP, India's core concern was the same: the impact of the agreement on the bilateral trade deficit. The decision to elevate the trade dialogue to the ministerial level signals the resolve of both sides to find some common ground to address the issue. However, we must temper down our expectations. Judging from the Chinese reluctance to accommodate our concern at the RCEP negotiations, the high-level dialogue may once again be the triumph of process over progress. What is India's leverage in the trade issue? First, both countries have divergent priorities. While India's challenge is to make itself more friendly to foreign manufacturing investment, China's challenge is to diversify its trade away from the United States. In this situation, China must pay attention to the growing Indian market. Second, an important issue for China is the US targeting of major Chinese technology firms to prevent them from getting global business. China is keen that India resist US pressure. The Indian government is caught between competing demands. Telecom companies want Huawei to bid because it keeps prices down. But the government must address the security risks of exposure to cyber threats in the future and the potential US sanctions risk of being caught up in an increasingly fractious US-China trade tensions. Huawei's participation in bidding for the rollout of 5G in India is the second leverage India has in resolving issues related to bilateral trade. Seventh, China is steadily shrinking India's strategic space in our neighborhood. While China seeks to move towards a Sino-centric Asian order, India's vision is that of a multipolar Asia. At Mamallapuram, both leaders agreed to uphold the rule-based order, even though there is a lack of agreement on what exactly constitutes this order. Within a multipolar order, China regards cooperation with India as a priority. India's growing economy, its importance to China as a trading partner, its role in Asia-centric governance institutions like AIIB and BRICS Bank, and its accretion of strategic capital through its strategic partnerships make it an important Asian interlocutor from China's point of view. At the same time, China seeks to diminish the strategic space for India in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. India is concerned at China's growing investments and influence in South Asian countries and the IOR. The strategic collusion between China and Pakistan exacerbates security challenges for India and the region. China's support to Pakistan, which has included nuclear and missile proliferation, encourages the latter to engage in brinkmanship with India. China's advocacy of Pakistan's core interest and agenda after the abolition of the special status for Kashmir is indicative of the strength or extent of China's strategic and economic investments in Pakistan, the increasing convergence and alignments of interests between the two countries, and Beijing's growing strategic ownership of Pakistan. The Indian Ocean is witnessing a rapid rise of Chinese naval presence on the high seas and in bases and places along the littoral. India's challenge is to counter China through its outreach to friendly countries and to limit the expansion of Chinese presence and influence without appearing too provocative. India is enhancing its maritime reach and connectivity based on its Sagar, Security and Growth for All, which seeks to create a safe, secure, stable, and shared maritime space by cultivating maritime linkages and building capacities amongst friendly states in the Indian Ocean region. The BRI is a grand strategy, unparalleled in scope and ambition, and far exceeding anything the world has seen before. It is also a masterly blueprint to integrate China's markets, gain access to resources, utilize excess domestic capacity, strengthen China's periphery, gain strategic military access in the maritime domain beyond the Eurasian heartland, and enlist all weather friends, as China calls its allies. Its origins may lie on the pressures on the CPC to develop China's western provinces and counter the impact of China's economic slowdown and lagging exports, but the BRI has evolved into a predominantly strategic mega project. This perception drives India's refusal to participate in the BRI. At Mamallapuram, she continued to urge Prime Minister Modi to cooperate in the China-India Plus projects and connectivity networks in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and BRI. Beijing may regard India's participation in BRI as essential for its characterization and success as an Asian project, but India remains cautious because of BRI's strategic intent, which is to create a Sino-centric Asian order. There is also the asymmetry of resources, and India cannot aspire to be an equal partner of China in the mega project. Despite this, India has significantly increased her economic assistance for infrastructure projects to South Asian countries in recent years. India can offer assistance on mutually favorable terms based on the priorities of recipient countries, in sharp contrast to exploitative Chinese lending under BRI, which has led to a pushback against BRI in some countries. Eighth, India-US relations have become a factor in China-India relations. China is increasingly concerned about India's strategic tilt towards the United States and the consequences it has for India's access to high technology and high-end defense equipment. India's participation in the Quad, trilateral, and exercises like the Malabar is a source of growing concern for Beijing, which regards these minilaterals as quasi-alliances. The United States want India to emerge as a regional balancer, and this is how India will be perceived by China in the years to come, despite India's protestations to the contrary. This is one of China's key concerns and driver behind the high-level dialogue with India, and also India's main leverage. It should not be surprising, therefore, that during the Mamallapuram summit, she stressed a strong endogenous input to bilateral relations, a clear reference to Chinese assessment that India should not allow itself to become an element in the new US strategic architecture aimed at balancing China. What does the future portend? China is unlikely to be flexible on key issues affecting India's national security, including the boundary dispute or its expanding footprint in South Asia and its growing strategic ownership of Pakistan. Nor will it be helpful on issues which India regards as key milestones in India's rise as a great power. For example, our quest for permanent membership of the UNSC or membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And if China does become flexible on these issues at a later date, the price India will have to pay will be to reverse its strategic tilt towards the United States and the West and regain its traditional middle ground in strategic terms. While a combination of external circumstances and summit diplomacy appear to have stabilized India-China relations, it remains to be seen how long India and China can sustain the process without substantial progress on the core issues that divide them. One key difference in the situations in both countries is that whereas India's drivers for the current phase of summit dialogues are primarily domestic in origin, China's are predominantly external. Domestic compulsions are unlikely to change in the short to medium term. whereas external factors could experience an unanticipated sea change at any time.
Thank you, Biren, for bringing out those broad trends in India-China relations, factors shaping this relationship, as also future, directions to the relationship. We now move on to our last panelist, Dr. G. Venkatraman, Associate Professor, Indian Institute of Management, Indore, who will be speaking on India-China economic ties, promises and challenges. Venkat.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Congratulations to OP Jindal University and its students for organizing such a wonderful conference. So, Sino-Indian economic relations. Now, we all know here that trade is something which, has played a very critical role in bringing countries together, notwithstanding their differences. You look at China and Japan, the differences are humongous, but if you look at the way they conduct their bilateral trade, that is amazing. The engagement is not, something which can be discounted. If you look at China and US, again, there are lots and lots of differences, but again, trade, people-to-people contacts is something which has always got them engaged. And this is the perplexing question, that how come these two countries which are so close to each other have a very ancient history of trading with each other and are not able to realize their potential. And no wonder, recently the current Indian ambassador to China, Ambassador Vikram Misri, when he assumed office, while giving interview to Global Times, he was asked, what is it that you would be focusing on as far as your the Sino-Indian relations are concerned? And he said, I have 3 areas to focus. And the first one was obviously, bilateral trade and economic relations. The other 2 being people-to-people contact, and then third, the cooperation over regional and global issues. China and India, if you look at the combined population, more than 35% of the world. In 2015, China contributed 36.75% of global economic growth, according to IMF figures. India contributed 16.5% to global economic growth. In the same year, US contributed 12.3%, whereas Japan contributed 0.7%. According to UNCTAD figures in 2015, the Chinese, FDI in China was $1.2 trillion, whereas in India it was $282.27 billion. Put together, the FDI constituted in both the countries 6% of the global FDI. As far as outward foreign direct investment is concerned, Chinese outward foreign direct investment was worth $1.1 trillion, and Indian outward foreign direct investment was $138.97 billion. Put together, both the countries 4.65% of global outward foreign direct investment. Now, this is something which I would like to draw your attention to. If you look at the bilateral foreign direct investment, outward foreign direct investment, both the countries. So, Chinese outward foreign direct investment with respect to India, it is merely 1.34% of their total, foreign direct outward foreign direct investment. As far as India is concerned, it constitutes only 0.03% of our total foreign direct investment. You see, look at the figures and they tell you a very big story. It's very nice to say that, both of them are engaging $100 million, etc., the usual thing. But what is it, the potential is, and to what extent we are able to realize? This is something which I wanted to draw your attention on. So therefore, no wonder the Indian Prime Minister has called upon both the countries to engage each other, and he said that 1 + 1 is 11. And Xi Jinping has basically said that, President Xi Jinping has said that both the countries, the Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant, need to coexist and dance together if we are to make a difference in this world. Recently, the CII conducted, a survey of 57 Indian companies doing business in China. And it's interesting to see what are their experiences. Unlike, what invariably many of us see is a very pessimistic kind of an outlook. It's not the bigger picture, or it is not the final say, but it's a very, it's a survey at the end of the day with all its limitations, but still it gives you a glimpse of how Indian businessmen are changing their mindsets as far as investing in China is concerned. Yes, the usual, stories, labor costs are increasingly getting higher, there is fierce competition, finding and retaining talent is a big task, pricing is a problem, etc., etc. But more interestingly, I would like to share, according to the survey, what were the positives? The positives were 2/3 of Indian companies doing business find doing business in China either profitable or very profitable. 30% of them in 2018 had revenues more than 100 million RMB. 98% of the current Indian firms who are operating there plan new investment, and 39% of them intend to boost their already existing investments in China. So this is the good things that we can look forward to. Because of lack of time, what I would do is to give a glimpse of the various issues that are they play a very critical role in bilateral trade and cooperation, corporate engagement. I would like to give you two examples. One example is of Indian engagement, corporate Indian economic or trade engagement in China, and another is Chinese engagement in India. So the one which I thought is an interesting story and which is very contemporary is the one regarding the sudden opening up of opportunities for our pharma players, Indian pharma players in the Chinese market. Now the Chinese pharma market is basically very, very huge. And currently in 2019, its total worth is $132 billion, but within 3 years, around 2022, is going to become $290 billion. So therefore, all the Indian companies, Dr. Reddy's, Sun Pharma, Aurobindo, they all are actually very busy, going to China and exploring. Now, what I would like you to what I'd like you to pay attention to is there is a context to all this. And what is the context? The context is that in the 2025 Made in China plan, there is one of the most important, things that is being focused on is focus on R&D in the health sector. One. Number two, there is a robust, venture capitalist economic ecosystem that supports R&D in pharma in China today. And then, Chinese government recently has launched healthcare reforms, and it also has made a call for Healthy China 2030 plan. So what are these new reforms that we are talking of? Let me take you through some of them. So number one, the Chinese government, as part of its healthcare reforms, has decided to reduce the drug prices and therefore increase the competition and to have more quality generics in their market. They also come up with a new drug law. In August 2019, the Standing Committee of NPC has passed this. And according to this new drug law, it has removed all the drugs that are legal till before August 2019. Those drugs which are not approved by the Chinese FDA were considered to be fake. But now, after this reform, what has happened is that those drugs which are approved by are sold by in the European market and in the American market, approved by FDAs there, now they are no more considered as fake. So therefore it paves the way for generics to go and do business there for the Indian players. Second, the Chinese FDA has now been renamed as the National Medical Products Administration, and it has been merged with the newly created State Administration for Market Regulation to optimize medicine regulation, and therefore the approval processes have also been speedened. So there are also new guidelines that are related to clinical trials, and therefore it paves the way for introduction of innovative drugs. The US FDA giving approvals to what is known as the abbreviated ANDAs, it is called abbreviated new drug applications in categories with lower competitions, and Indian pharma having advantage. So therefore Indian pharma has advantage to enter here because those which have been already approved there can basically come to the Chinese market, and before the other competitors come in, they have a very critical chance to get ahead of their competitors. Then there is something called the CGT, which is comprehensive gene therapy. So more R&D in the off-patent drugs and sharp decline in the time approval for introduction of these drugs has once again basically paved the way for Indian companies going there and doing business. So what I would like to share here is there are already 5 JVs between Indian pharma players and the Chinese sides currently. So therefore, pharma has, which was for a very long time, this has been a hurdle, an area which has, stopped deeper engagement between the two countries. And but what is interesting is the opportunity has come not because of a result of what both the sides have been working for. It has come because there is an urgent necessity from the Chinese side to restructure this whole thing because of what is desirable for them at this point of time. We want healthcare, so therefore it opened up. So this is something which is a point which we cannot ignore. Now let me come to the other side of the story. That is, let me give you an example of the Chinese investment in India. While doing a very small research, very quick research, I found out 2 interesting stories. One story happens to be, the growing Chinese presence in the what is known as the peer-to-peer lending, market in India. And this also has a context, the Chinese context. This peer-to-peer lending, the Chinese government had made a major crackdown to root out fraud and improve credit to startups in China, because there was a lot of exploitation there by some of the fintech companies there. So these fintech companies actually, started, looking for other opportunities. And one of the opportunities was what? Asia's 3rd largest market. So let's go and look at India. So currently, there is no major foreign investment restrictions in this particular space. So applying, yes, the foreign players can apply for license, but applying for license takes time. So therefore, another thing is through automatic FDI route can be done through JVs. So therefore, many of these companies are actually Chinese companies are entering into JVs with their Indian counterparts and entering this P2P lending sector. So, for example, Cashbus, through its investment vehicle Jade Value, made its first investment in a microcredit provider, Oli Credit, for example. Another interesting story about Chinese investment in India is that which is about the startups, the Chinese engagement in Indian startups. In fact, after the American and the Indian, VCs, it is the Chinese are the 3rd most, active funders. So 10 of them have participated in 31 funding rounds in the recent past. And in fact, in 2016, their, participation was worth $668 million US. And in 2018, it became $5.66 billion US. So Alibaba, is currently, funding 5 Indian unicorns, Paytm Mall, Snapdeal, Big Basket, Zomato. These are some of the companies which they are, funding in. And Tencent is doing it in 6 of them actually, Hike, the messaging app, and Ride, Ola, Byju's, and, Dream11, online gaming, Policy Bazaar in the insurance sector, Swiggy, so they are, investing in all this. But again, it's a very very important to note that there is a certain kind of a pattern which we are seeing in this kind of an investment. And what are those, so number one, the investment of Chinese in this particular field is actually not again something, forget about the good and bad. It is again a byproduct of a certain policy change that has happened in China. It's not that it is having a self-generating momentum and this has happened. So why these companies, fintech companies have come to India? They have come to India because the startup funding party has slowed down in China. So therefore they have come. Second is, India's youth and, they are changing consumption habits, growing internet penetration, their their propensity to be very comfortable with technology. So all these things have, and very young people are, Indian youth is looking to get into startups, but there is paucity of capital, so therefore go to India. Second is, it is seen that, the kind of funding that has happened in this area is, Chinese fancy their success in India because they already have a very deep domain exposure as far as similar kind of opportunities which were not available in China previously. So they've already done a lot of research through their business experience. They are coming up with very robust ways in which, this business can be done. So therefore they have huge experience. And then of late, however, in the recent past, some companies like, for example, Fosun are very, very, conscious of the fact that let us, try to fly a bit low. Let us let us bide our time. Let us play the game patiently. So therefore, they are maintaining a low profile, but at the same time, gradually they want to, test the waters and then, increase. And we are also seeing that in the, in these Chinese venture capitalists are setting up fellowship programs for entrepreneurs in India. So the thing is, whether it is Indian investment in China or Chinese investment in India, we see that in the example that I have given, it is some kind of changes and reforms that we are seeing within the Chinese setup itself, which has led to this kind of new opportunities and exploring new avenues of bilateral investment in each other's countries. So therefore, what do we do about it? Now this is where we need to be very practical. I always tell, whenever someone asks me, my students, they talk about how come we will, engage at China where it has done this, it has done that, Doklam is there, CPEC there, this is that. But life is tough. And, when Chinese have never loved to play ball with the Americans, but no matter what have been the problems, they have dealt with it. And in 1980s, they said, Putang tho. 90s also they said, okay, do your work, focus on your work. Just because they did not have a great liking for the Americans, they did not stop engaging them. And today we are in a situation 15 years, 20 years back, perhaps we had the option, not only we, but that is for the whole world, whether to engage China or not to engage. That was an option perhaps the world had. But today that is no more an option, whether we like it or not. So therefore, I think we need to, I'm not saying that we need to surrender to China. I'm not saying treading a line which is, can be perceived as dovish and, India, China, bye-bye. We need to be extremely realistic. But having said that, that doesn't mean that, take ourselves, back completely, isolate ourselves, do our own muscle flexing. Now is the time for us to be realistic, but at the same time, it's very important for us to be putang tho and bide for a time. And as they say, apna time aayega. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Venkat, for bringing out all those possibilities, India-China economic relations, and also, for reminding us that our economic engagement with China is well beyond just looking at the issue of yawning trade deficit. Well, we have about 15 to 20 minutes for discussions on 3-4 very good presentations which have been made. So floor is open for questions and comments. I'll start with the younger colleagues first. So please, why don't you? Please identify yourself. Keep your question or comment as brief as possible.
Thank you, everyone. My name is
In
Pawan.
case you are addressing your question to any specific
Yes.
panelist, you can
Yes, sir.
name the panelist.
My name is Pawan Raghavendra. I'm a third-year student of International Relations at Shivanada University. My question is directed to Professor Venkatraman. Sir, you had mentioned the need for FDI, Chinese FDI in India, as well as Indian investment in China. However, there is a distinction that needs to be made between brownfield and greenfield investments, where greenfield is when a company sets up infrastructure, resources, etc., from the ground, from scratch, and brownfield, where companies generally just buy out or lease existing infrastructure and technologies. So, and it has been observed that a lot of Chinese companies, with respect to FDI abroad, have been engaging in brownfield rather than greenfield investment. So, since this is negative when it comes to the development of the country in terms of how FDI can improve the country, how do we ensure that we get more of greenfield investment, and how do we ensure that there's not too much of brownfield investment? Thank you.
We will combine some questions and comments, then get back to the panelist. Okay.
Hello, I am Anu. I am research assistant at Institute of Chinese Studies. So my question is a basic question about informal summit. Since the panel, it's for the panel, because as General Narasimhan mentioned, that we are looking for institutionalizing the informal summits. So the word informal and institutionalization of informal, so it appears to me a bit contradictory, because if we are moving towards informal summits, means that we are moving away from the heckles and the hurdles that institutionalization process puts on in the bilateral relations. And if we are thinking of institutionalizing the informal summit, then what does it mean that we are again moving towards the institutionalizing, or is this does this indicate that India and China are finding ways to not to get into permanent treaties or concrete agreement where they have to have binding to agreements with each other? That's all.
Hello. Thank you, panel, for the wonderful presentation. My name is Justin. I'm from IIT Madras. When we talk about the latest summit between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi, I have a serious problem when we talk about the summit. This is something called Chennai Connect, but it didn't happen in Chennai. It is like 60 kilometers far from the city. It's in another district, actually. And again, another important problem with this is that it's a 7th century city built by the Pallavas, and they had such a wonderful connection between China and between these two civilizations. So while using, instead of something else, when we use Chennai Connect, are we really covering something or neglecting those kinds of something called a tranquil fraternity relations between these two civilizations from our younger generations? So when we hear about Chennai Connect, they will think that, okay, some usual summit happened in between these two countries. So instead of Chennai Connect, I would suggest something called Mamallapuram Mantra or something. Then people will be curious to search more on this kinds of things. Thank you.
My name is Parth. I'm a final year student of economics, and I'm minoring in international relations at Shiv Nada University. So we have seen consistency in the diplomatic culture of our country, but in the recent years there has been certain departures, especially taking certain hard stances when it comes to countries that we perceive, or at least the government perceives, are working against our interest. But the same cannot be done and has not been done with respect to China. We, even if China speaks in a manner, or their foreign ministry takes out certain statements that is detrimental or to our effort, we cannot go for any sort of a diplomatic isolation. Instead, we have to engage with them. So in light of that, how do we, this very question of management, if you could just shed some light on how do we manage our relations in the future, given that we have had certain change in our diplomatic stance in the recent time. Thank you.
I have two small questions. One is to Alka ma'am. My question is, like you were saying that, there's this use of word management. There's this use of word management repeatedly. So do you think China is also managing their relations with India, like diplomatic relations with India? How do you understand that? And my second question is to Professor Venkat. I think it's interesting to say that, all the changes that has happened is as per the policy changes. So with the drug law that has changed, do you think there's any scope for the Indian drug companies to, the generic drug companies to enter into the Chinese market?
is that do you believe that the multiplicity of ideological approach which has been there in Indian politics, for example, till 60s, there was a consensual model of politics, more or less. Congress was there in almost in the center, in the states. So somehow, I mean, that may not be the reason, possibly alone. There were other geopolitical factors as well, but somehow the consensual model of politics that we had, it sort of gave one approach of India-China relations. And over the years, it has ventured into every domain, and then we have a different government, which again possibly is leading towards one direction. But then, I think it tends to sort of tends to be that there is a push and pull factor in how to approach China. Do you think it is there, and possibly sorting it out can be of some help?
I actually have a question for you, Ambassador. Yes, for you. I know, but I think it'd be nice if you could answer one question. Given that Ms. Alka was talking about management, and yesterday the Minister of State used the word prudence in his speech. I think every other sentence he talked about the relationship and prudence. And I was writing down every time he said the word prudence, and it's like 14 or 15 times. So I think that sort of sends a message to all the students. If they haven't gotten that message, they should get it. So in your experience, are we really going to do anything other than manage or be prudent on this relationship? If you could just say something about that for the students.
Dialogue in Bhutan University. Actually, the topic was China-India dialogue on the boundary question in the new context. Okay? And the new context had many meanings to many people. They thought it was the post-Mamallapuram context. Chennai Connect they also used. We were, I witnessed a similar 1 versus 9 kind of situation. Thanchung pleading for the civilizational perspective that the current development should be connected with larger historical processes and the civilizational bonds. The rest of the group, there were some 25 Chinese and 6 Indians. And everyone was on very specific, Kashmir, Ladakh, or SR dialogue, and things like that. Some on economic also. Now, so my question is, and I will slightly modify their Thanchung's plea and here Alka's plea, that I think even the current positions have to be informed by the larger historical and civilizational understanding in order that the management is effective. So I don't think management is a dirty concept. The management can be effective and have more stable long-term consequences if it has a solid ground. Now, based on this small comment, my question to I think the whole panel, but maybe some of you, General Narasimhan and Ambassador Nanda, can respond. Has the decision-making process in India become a bit isolated and and overconfident of its own capacity in segmental ways, that the kinds of wider consultation which would have those inputs from historians and economists and many others, that is within government, outside government, and so on. Has the decision-making process, because there was one paper in China And this comment was made by an Indian scholar located visiting China at that time. He said that, oh my God, so many NGOs and think tanks and mushrooming now in China. Their inputs they are taking, of course, most of them are also set up by the government or supported by the government, but they are engaged in exercises with very long-term investment in study of history, culture, economy, and so on. Therefore, has there been and it's not about the current regime, I think it's last, decade, maybe 2 decades, I don't know, but has there been an increasing overconfidence of our decision-making bodies that, is this, which is reflected in what Alka calls the management approach, managing the existential challenge rather than having a long-term view? Thank you.
I have a small, can I just get back to the panel in between? With you, yeah.
Opportunities for Chinese firms in India, I think already there is a huge beeline. I opened a piece of information which will directly give you. So if you see Dr. Reddy, Sun Pharma, Cipla, Aurobindo Pharma, Piramal Enterprises, Wokat, all these people are already established their presence in China in the form of JV or the other. So yeah, so this is very recent only, and so therefore independent manufacturing facilities they are looking for. How do we ensure greenfield projects, investment in India and brownfield? I think this problem is very much, not as simple as greenfield versus brownfield kind of a thing. I think you see the Chinese investment in those who are investing within China and those who are investing outside China. The way the investment is done in terms of greenfield projects, I mean the scale and the speed is amazing. And for now Chinese have started giving focus to environment in a big way, right? After so much of damage has been done. But some time back, you see, whether it is land or whether it is, impact on environment or whether it is, some other grounds, everything is doable there, right? But when they go to other countries, that same thing is not easy for them, and so therefore it is a very major challenge for them to actually start a greenfield project, because in those countries where you have very strong governance mechanisms, it's very difficult or more or less impossible for them to get things so quickly to start a new project. That's a greenfield project. So therefore for them it is easier actually to get brownfield project. I think that is what.
Anything else?
Okay.
The institutionalization of the informal summit. I am talking about the informal summits being a regular kind of a feature. And we shouldn't probably mix up the outcomes of that or how these things are going to be handled with the government. That is a different issue. So what I meant by institutionalizing this summit is basically the happening is getting regular and it is going to continue to happen. That's precisely what I meant on that. As far as that pharma companies are concerned, I see that you have an apprehension there, and I support that apprehension. There are restrictions there, but also there are opportunities coming up in terms of, say for example, Hainan. Hainan has got a SEZ wherein the other restrictions that are applicable in the mainland are not applicable there. So they are taking a different route to go into the country with investments, etc., etc. Professor Manoranjan Mohanty's thing on the decision-making process, sir, I am very sure that the consultations are on, but only thing is probably it is not in the open domain. That is the way I would like to put it across to you. You had a question, I thought that was not partially answered.
Domestic ideological divergences will affect our policy question?
No, I don't think so. I'm sure he'll bear me out on this. I don't think that is happening in any kind of considerable fashion. I leave it at that.
I thought there were two questions. One was whether Indian diplomacy can take a firm stand. I think if you study the practice of Indian diplomacy, you will find that on many occasions in multilateral arena and bilateral arena, we do take a firm stand, but generally we are oriented towards flexibly trying to negotiate a mutually acceptable resolution if that is possible. We don't engage. There's one big difference between Chinese diplomacy and Indian diplomacy, and that is we don't engage in soft coercion. So if you understand what I'm trying to say, that during the first BRI summit, there were very threatening messages from the Chinese Global Times, which is affiliated to the People's Daily, trying to shape outcomes through threatening the adversary. It's not done by the government, it's done by a section of the society which is working in some institutions. The same thing happened during Doklam too. So that is an instrument of diplomacy, and it has been used in other areas also. Second thing, sir, I think it's of course very important, Professor Mohanty mentioned about getting the views of academia. Here I would like to suggest two things. One is that I don't think consultation will work until it's built into the system. If we really feel strongly, maybe then there should be an institutional framework of a revolving door. Academics working in advisory institutions attached to ministries and then coming back to academia, as happens in the United States and other countries. I also think one more thing. From my own experience, I'm speaking very frankly, I say that academics will also have to transition to a practitioner's mindset. You see, if you study a PhD thesis and if you study a book written by a practitioner of foreign policy, the practitioner of foreign policy writes in a style and a medium, and his thought processes are easier to follow for the for the people working in government or people working in who are managing foreign policy. So that's why they tend out to be more influential. If you look at the 10, 15, 20 most influential books for example, which have come out of Western sources, you find that they are written by practitioners, and 8 or 7 would have been written by practitioners, only 2 or 3 written by pure academics. So that I think is very, very important. Thank you.
So, by no means is management a dirty word at all. I did not really use it in that sense, because the essence of diplomacy and policy is to focus on the practical, to do what is achievable. And so, I mean, when I use that term and in coordination with the use of this term prudent, it just essentially I was trying to drive home the point that there are these two realms which should ideally have an interactive kind of a basis. That while one focuses on the doable, the practical, which is also not to say that therefore one is completely, that academics therefore ipso facto becomes impractical. I mean, that is something which really quite psychs me at many times, because what academics bring is a certain depth and a certain understanding coming out from a very deep study of the subject. And that does definitely have policy implications. So that depth of understanding can then inform the more management-oriented, where possibly they could tweak their policy to make it more effective. So this interface between the managers and the researchers becomes quite critical. Ideally there should be a relationship of the utmost disrespectful admiration for each other. Yes, certainly, but I think there should be an interface. So my argument was essentially about that, not that management is bad, but the problem is that the overwhelming focus on the management aspect and the very little actual fundamental questions that are being inquired into, gives me a moment of disquiet. We should have more people who are going in depth into something that is so rich and so varied and so rewarding. Usha, I haven't seen the word management really in most of the Chinese writings that I've seen. I mean, it's about the India-China relationship, and there is, as always, an overwhelming focus on the practical as far as Chinese writings are also concerned. So they are always talking about this should be done, that should be done, and and the threatening overtones which keep coming nowadays more frequently. I think over the last 5 years, I have seen far more threatening overtones, particularly in journalistic writing in China. Now, we can do a good analysis of that, but the academics don't really talk like that. So there is a very interesting development that is happening within China also. And I think somebody should look at that also. So my plea essentially, let's do more in-depth studies on what is happening in China, in India, between India and China.
Well, your question, which is posed to me, like management, prudence is not a dirty word. It's good to be prudent, and yes, but prudence, if you mean in a way management, that you are managing an existing situation. It's a complex relationship. That's something we keep repeating all the time, which needs to be managed in a sensible and sensitive fashion, which is true. But at the same time, I can give any number of examples how innovative initiatives have been taken, how innovative steps have been taken in India-China relations, which have been of great impact. Just to give one very recent example, idea of informal summit. And as Jan Narasimhan said, institutionalization of informal summit. China doesn't have institutionalized informal summit with any country other than with India at the level of President Xi Jinping today. And it's a very useful mechanism where leaders take ownership of a very difficult relationship. That's one. I can give you example of decision taken in 1993 to make line of actual control as the basis of management of India-China border engagement. Very important decision which has resulted in ensuring peace and tranquility in border areas. Or decision 2003 to set up mechanism of special representatives, which has resulted in at least one major breakthrough, agreement on political parameters and guiding principles in 2005. But more such initiatives need to be taken. I think we have fallen into the rut of managing the existing situation, ignoring structural challenges in India-China relations. Unless we deal with those challenges, I think we run the risk of going through this trajectory of up and down in relationship. Well, I'll get back to Vidyut now. Yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so if we have not, on the right side of the room, very brief. Avinash is, sort of giving me dirty looks already. So please be very brief. Just 2-3 questions or comments. Yeah, please. You have the,
couple of questions to...
Be very brief.
Yeah, a couple of questions to General Narasimhan, sir. So, there is a growing rhetoric amongst the Indian society that challenges the extent to which the problems of the past are considered, right? For example, Doklam 62. And as polarizing as this may sound, we are definitely obsessing over reports of the problems of the past that we still have to be, submitting. So, don't you think, and I do agree and acknowledge that the historical dimension of the bilateral ties is very important to understanding these two countries, but don't you think it's time we moved from the rhetoric that speaks about what India could have done to what is India's response to the BRI? How is India going to tackle the growing power imbalance in the South China Sea? Second question, so a key component to understanding the two countries has always been the presence of a third actor, right? For example, Pakistan, Tibet, you could say so. So my question is, and we also do consider questions of regional security architecture and so on. So do you think the blocks of the Cold War will ever make a return, or do you not see that as a possibility? Thank you.
Okay, anyone on the back rows? First I'll just, yeah. Okay, Malika. Very quick.
Sir, given the trade deficit that India shares with China and Japan, can you differentiate in the nature of informal summits that we have with China and the formal summits institutionalized with Japan? The PM meetings that we have every year with Japan and the informal summits we are planning to institutionalize with China.
Okay, anyone else? Front row, yeah, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is for anyone present here who could help me kind of negotiate a question that came to me. So basically, whenever I hear about China-India relations, one thing that I don't see approached is what form of influence India can try to use. So I see two options, right? Either you can try what India is currently going through, is a more centralized authoritarian basis of policy framework and governance, where you have a strong center which kind of decides what its peripheries want to should do, or you try to be the playmaker in a different philosophy, where you try to look at a socialist democratic framework, where you try to push for a slightly different form of governance and try to talk to China on a different basis, something that I think foundational thinking and philosophy would closer align to if you look at the constitution. So what should India go for, keeping in mind that there is this idea that we need to start being realistic, that the world has moved on from a Western liberal ideology to something new, and where a multipolarity, where a multipolar world is imminent if not already established. So should we go for a central authoritarian system, and is that the better way to achieve whatever India sees to be its power quantum, or should it try to be socialist democratic?
Okay. Could we get back to panel now? So.
Okay. We must understand the basis on which we actually did not sign on to that MOU on BRI. I still call it One Belt, One Road, basically because the Chinese website still says Ita Ilu. The understanding is, if you do a real cost-benefit analysis of One Belt, One Road, that will give you a real answer as to whether you should actually get onto this One Belt, One Road or otherwise. The first priority was, of course, the territorial integrity, which we had very clearly articulated. The second one was till today, actually, I've been asking in many of the forums, this question comes to me every forum in which I speak to. The problem that comes up is nobody is still able to define as to what you mean by joining One Belt, One Road. What do you mean by that? That nobody is able. Basically, what it implies is that you sign that draft trade agreement that the Chinese are putting out. In the second BRF forum that they had in April this year, there was a departure in the sense that they softened their approach towards dealing with these projects, etc. But we are watching it carefully for any kind of proof of that particular thing happening. Their contacts becoming open, their contacts becoming transparent, and they are being judicious in allocating these contacts, etc. We are still yet to see that happening on ground. The grievance redressal mechanism is still located only in China. How do the other countries go and get their grievances redressed? There's no way they can do it otherwise. They have to go to China all the time. And we know how the Chinese legal system, I'm sure there's a session on that here earlier. So the issue on BRI is not typically one to say that, okay, why have we not joined, we'll be left out. I personally feel that we are not going to be left out of anything on this, actually speaking. There are a lot of dialogue that has taken place, a lot of routes that have been discussed within India in the academic community and even in the strategic community. One route was from Calcutta to Nathula and beyond. One was from eastern Ladakh and beyond. Third one was Bombay, Delhi, Kathmandu and beyond. Fourth one was even more enterprising. Bombay, Delhi, going westwards to Pakistan, to Iran and joining. All these things have been talked about. But the problem is, if you do a real cost-benefit analysis, you stand nowhere by joining in BRI. The second thing is on the South China Sea. South China Sea, the only interest that we have, 55% of our trade flows through South China Sea. Therefore, you need to be careful about freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight. That is what we have been saying officially everywhere. If you see the statements, this is precisely what we have been saying. Freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. That is basically to protect our interest on trade, which 55% of which flows through South China Sea. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. And these are the reactions based on real analysis that has been done as to what is in our interest. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. Second is on the Cold War. There was a question on the Cold War issue here. In some form, some tenets of Cold War is being seen. But how is it going to pan out is anybody's guess. Basically because if you find that US has mentioned Russia and China as revisionist powers and they have been taking action on it, next time when the trade agreement takes place between US and China, where does that go? And President Trump himself has made a statement, if the trade agreement is done, probably Huawei will be acceptable. So we'll have to wait and see as to how this is going to pan out. There may be some elements of Cold War you can see, but then how is it going to pan out is anybody's guess today. Informal summit and formal summit, there's a question. I don't know who asked that question. Yeah. What is the question actually? Between Abe and the formal one, see the relationships are different. You please understand the kind of relationship that India and Japan has got and India and China has got. The kind of problems we have in India-China bilateral relationship, you don't have it with Japan. So there things could happen differently, here things will happen differently. Because if you compare both, it is like actually comparing oranges and apples. It doesn't work like that. So I think informal summit is a way in which we are trying to find a move forward on the bilateral relations here. On the formal relations that are already existing, you can go whole hog little better on formal summits. So that is the way probably you need to see it. The strong center social democratic network, please understand, even if you have anything socially going, that's the question actually coming out from what he said earlier. Ultimately, the decision-making body has to be the central government in these relationships. They may consult anybody, they may take all the actions, they may take all the inputs, etc. Finally, the decision will be taken there. So what do you call that? Centralized or not decentralized? I leave it to you.
I was going to say one line and Avinash is looking at me. I go back, please.
Well, Viren, do you have to say anything? Okay, well, thank you very much. So on that note, let me, bring this session to a close by thanking all the panelists. Please give them a big round of applause. And I thank all of you for a very stimulating session. So thank you.